Hi, this is Nicole with Global Nomads Group. In this webcast today, in partnership with the New York Times Learning Network, we will explore the causes and consequences of the Somalia humanitarian crisis, which has affected more than 4 million Somalis. That's more than half the total population. Coupled with this is the fear that the international community is less likely to intervene. Since 1991, Somalia has been known as a broken state, meaning that it has been without an effective central government. According to the UN Human Development Index, it is one of the poorest and most violent places in the world. Tens of thousands of Somalis have fled to the Dadaab refugee camp in neighboring Kenya, currently known as the world's largest. According to the UN, this is the most severe food crisis in the world today. There is a need of $2.5 billion to respond to the crisis in the Horn of Africa, especially to tackle the famine in Somalia. The New York Times recently reported that 75,000 Somalis are at risk of starving to death and succumbing to diseases such as malaria and cholera in the next 3 months. What are the political and environmental factors that have fueled the food crisis? And what is being done to combat the crisis? So correction, the New York Times actually noted there's over 750,000 Somalis at risk. These are just some of the questions that we'll cover in today's webcast. We have an amazing and diverse panel of experts who are connected to the crisis and can help us better understand what is fueling this humanitarian crisis. But before we get started, just a couple of reminders. First, I encourage you all to make comments and ask questions during and throughout the webcast by the live chat function at the bottom of the screen. Also, we'll have throughout the program, we'll have a poll question for you to refer to with the answer revealed at the end. So actually, I'll refer to that right now. So what do you think is causing the crisis in Somalia and in the Horn of Africa? Is it 1, poverty, 2, lack of rain, or 3, political corruption, or 4, all of the above? The answer will be revealed at the end. If you just go to the bottom right-hand side of your screen, choose your answer, and then click Finish to return back to the screen. So now I'll introduce the panel, and also Happy Rosh Hashanah to everyone out there. And this is truly a global experience. We have schools from the UK joining us, as well as a gentleman from the Africa Future organization joining us from Kenya, who just returned from Somalia. So thank you for joining us as well. So now I'll introduce the panel. Greg Winter is the foreign desk editor at the New York Times. He oversees the coverage of Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the UN, and supervises the paper's correspondence in those regions. As a result, he manages coverage of Somalia and the famine there. Jeffrey Hoover is the Northeast Regional Field Coordinator for CARE Action Network. He oversees CARE's citizen advocacy for New York State and New England. One of his main focuses at CARE has been the response to the crisis in the Horn of Africa through fundraising and creating public awareness. Jamie Vernald is an associate in the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. She provides research assistance and monitors developments within Somalia and the Horn of Africa region. She also assists with Somalia-related advocacy efforts. And Abdi Phenomenal, who is joining us from Minnesota, is a spoken word artist of Poet Nation, college student, and native of Somalia. He spent 5 years at the Dadaab refugee camp before moving to New York City and then to Minnesota. He is currently featured in a documentary, Voices of Dadaab, that tells the story of his return to the Dadaab refugee camp. And now, a quick look at the political and environmental causes of the famine. Since 1991, Somalia has been a failed state, which means that there is no functioning central government. The former government was toppled by clan militias that later turned on each other. The Somali Transitional Federal Government is trying to bring stability to an extremely volatile country, but without much success. Moreover, they enlist hundreds of child soldiers, many under the age of 12. Since 2006, the country has faced an armed rebellion led by Al-Shabaab, one of Africa's most notorious militant Islamist groups. Al-Shabaab controls much of southern Somalia and has been connected to Al-Qaeda since 2007. Somalia is located in the Horn of Africa, a dry, arid region which experiences frequent droughts due to limited rainfall, where farming and agriculture become extremely difficult. This has led to increased poverty, famine, disease, and migration on a large scale. In essence, environmental and political instability have fueled the famine. According to the New York Times, the Islamist militant group Al-Shabaab is keeping aid agencies out of southern Somalia and blocking food delivery. This will immediately impact over 750,000 Somalis, as we have already mentioned. In 1990, Somalia was also stricken with famine, in which, quote, the UN rallied behind more than 25,000 American troops, embarked on a multi-billion-dollar mission to beat back the gunmen long enough to get food into the mouths of starving people. With the 2011 crisis, the motivation to intervene is different, and some organizations are hesitant to move aid in. We will now address these challenging issues now. Greg, in 2007, you had an interview with Jeffrey Gettleman of the New York Times. You asked, what would happen to the Horn of Africa if the US held back and did not get involved? Would it become the incubator of terrorism? What did you mean by this? And how do you think the motivation to intervene has changed since 1990?
Well, let me just try to put things in perspective a little bit. That 750,000 figure, that's not the total number of people who are affected by the drought. Millions are. The 750,000 is the number of people that the United Nations thinks will run out of food in the next few months should things not turn around drastically. So that's essentially the number of people who could starve to death without some large-scale humanitarian effort. Now, there was a large-scale humanitarian effort, truly large-scale, in the early 1990s, but still, these are very difficult things to address. Still, in that case, a couple of 100,000 people died, about 250,000, but it was, some recent estimates indicate that about 100,000 or more were saved by the aggressive military intervention to set up humanitarian corridors. It's unknown how this is going to play out, but essentially what we're talking about are two main dangerous combinations, and that is drought and conflict. And pretty much anytime you have those things in combination, it's very difficult to provide adequate humanitarian response just through humanitarian procedures alone. You have the militant group Shabaab, which has pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda, which really has, for the most part, taken advantage of the Somali population for quite a number of years now, for a few years now. And they have preyed on the population in many respects, but they've also been very hostile to having Western aid come in. So that makes it much more difficult for aid groups to respond to a crisis of this nation, of this magnitude. Usually the way the system works is that, or I don't know, works is not maybe the best word, but usually the way events unfold is that people are dying in places, people are in great need of aid. Groups like Human Rights Watch, like CARE, like other aid organizations raise the alarm, and we write about it. Governments are slow to respond, but as publicity builds and they become generally embarrassed by their inaction, they pledge great monies to try to address a crisis. In this case, you have a place where there is no functioning central government, there is no control over the country. So even if there weren't an economic crisis around the globe, even if people weren't focused on debts in Europe and debts in the United States, and there was willingness to come forward with the aid money, it's not clear how that aid would be distributed because there's not control of the country. So that's what we're dealing with here.
Thank you so much, Greg. Jamie, according to Human Rights Watch, there is no quick fix to Somalia's tragedy. A more secure and rights-respecting Somalia will be less prone to violence and famine. What human rights abuses are occurring as a result of this?
As Greg mentioned, you have the fact that in Somalia there's really no functioning government. In Mogadishu, there's the transitional federal government, the TFG, backed by AMISOM, the African Union mission there. And it's not just Al-Shabaab who has been committing abuses. We've documented in the last 5 years, really, the fact that Al-Shabaab will be in Mogadishu, and when conflict arises, they will fire from civilian locations, and that's a crime of war. It's called human shielding. And the problem is that the response that you have from Amazon is to shell really heavily on those civilian populations, and that results in more human rights violations and deaths of civilians. So there's that aspect to the conflict. Additionally, throughout Somalia, you have Al-Shabaab reigning in Central and South Somalia. And there's other types of abuses. For example, there is recruitment of children as well as adults. That's forced recruitment. And particularly in regards to the famine, Al-Shabaab has actually started taxing livestock and taking livestock, as well as keeping people from fleeing Somalia, and that you have the right to movement, and they've actually impeded that. Similarly, the transitional federal government forces have actually committed human rights abuses as well in their controlled areas by committing arbitrary arrests, killings, and actually recently looting food aid that's coming to civilians. So there are all these different varieties of abuses occurring by all sides of the conflict, not just Al-Shabaab.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And our next question is for Abdi in Minnesota. What do you think about what has been said, and what do you think is really fueling the crisis in Somalia?
First and foremost, thanks for having me. This is one of the biggest crises, like humanitarian crisis, I've ever come across. This is the second famine that's happening here in Somalia. And just in recent poem that I just wrote called The Voices of the Dab, I've said man-made or from God, someone tagged all along. Meaning, God has, obviously it hasn't rained for 3 years in some areas in Somalia. And I feel like the world has, ignored Somalia and has grown tired of us. And I feel like it has to do with a combination of all those things. And the Somali people just want the pursuit of happiness just like everybody else. And I feel like that we need to create awareness to this situation.
Thank you so much for that. And now we're going to take a question from our audience. And please remember, everyone, take the poll at the bottom right of the screen as well. We're going to skip the question from the audience. And again, remember, at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, you can choose your answer to the poll question and then click Finish, and that will return you to the screen. And now we're going to take a look at the response from the international community through a series of videos. Recently, the international president of Doctors Without Borders, Dr. Uni Karunakara, condemned other organizations and the media for glossing over the reality in order to convince people that simply giving money for food was the answer. He goes on to say that charities needed to start treating the public like adults. He went on, "There is a con. There is an unrealistic expectation being peddled that you give your 50 pounds and suddenly those people are going to have food to eat. Well, no. We need that 50 pounds, yes. We will spend it with integrity. But people need to understand the reality of the challenges in delivering that aid. We don't have the right to hide it from people. We have a responsibility to engage the public with the truth." A key question to consider is, how are NGOs responding to the crisis? So how are NGOs responding to this crisis? Jeff, CARE's humanitarian director, Barbara Jackson, who traveled to the region, recently stated, "Everyone I met had the same message. Please tell the world for us that we need help and that we need it now. We cannot last much longer." What do you think about the Doctors Without Borders quote that he's glossing over the situation, and what is CARE doing to respond to the crisis?
The message, absolutely, I completely agree with these people. They do need immediate help, and they need it yesterday. And how that plays into the Doctors Without Borders quote, I think they really go hand in hand. And I think that's absolutely correct that, a mere 50 pounds, as was mentioned, or $50 is not going to solve the problem, but it is absolutely needed. And that really ties into exactly how CARE is responding to the crisis, is that we are dealing with the immediate humanitarian aid with other NGOs, with the U.S. government, with other foreign governments. there is an immediate need to deliver food, to deliver water and sanitary products, but that's not going to solve the problem. CARE's been in Somalia and in the Horn of Africa for over 10 years now, and clearly the problem still exists. It's happening today. So what's also needed on top of yours and my $50 is a comprehensive approach to how we deal with this. We need to deal with the realities of climate change that really is causing this. We need to work with the people in the communities to develop a wider array of resources and a wider array of forms of income, so when something is taken from them as a result of climate change, there are other things they can fall back on. So I'd absolutely agree that glossing over it and not talking about the realities of all of the challenges that we face is very irresponsible, and it's not going to lead to a permanent fix to this situation. What we need is to deal with the reality of what exactly is happening, what exactly is causing this, and the multitude of things that need to happen, and the enormous will that's going to need to be taken to fix this in the end.
Thank you, Jeff. Greg, in your opinion, what is the best way to engage the public with the truth, but give them a realistic portrayal of where their much-needed donations will go?
Well, I don't think anybody is under the misimpression that simply forcing humanitarian aid to be delivered over the objections of the Shabab would solve the problems of Somalia. Nobody was under that impression. We're talking about systematic recovery that's needed for Somalia. This is a country where employment is very scarce. Hence, people turn to piracy in order to try to earn some money. This is a place where schooling is very scarce. Not only does the Shabab recruit amongst children, but we have documented numerous instances in which the federal government recruits child soldiers as well and relies on child soldiers as well. This is a place where many children are much more familiar with guns than they are with books. This is a place where there's really very little industry and opportunities for people. It's also a place where agriculture is tough in many places, so it has become reliant on aid. Therefore, anytime there's conflict, it makes people more and more susceptible to famine. So you're really talking about a reconstruction of a country, and how you do that is a matter of fierce international debate. Obviously, the international community and the United Nations and the United States has been backing the transitional federal government, but the transitional federal government is very weak, controls only small amounts of the country, and has been almost unable to control the capital. Only now does it really control the capital for several years. So there's a lot of debate about how to do it. Do you support local efforts, sort of local authorities like you see in Somaliland, which is pretty much an independent area, although it's not recognized internationally as such? That's the debate right now in the international community. Nobody really has the answers, I have to be honest.
Thank you for that. And now we have a question live from our audience. So why did the international community not act adequately to save thousands of lives? And this question I will pose to Jamie. So thank you.
Sure. I think one thing you have to remember is that there's a great hesitancy to get involved in Somalia because of prior experience, but also because of the magnitude of the problem. Not only do you have this current famine, but you also have that underlying conflict and political unrest within the country. So I think part of the current problem is providing solutions to the international community, to the UN, that are more positive and different ways of looking at the problem that's political, because I think Human Rights Watch would say and has said that it's really a political solution needed to the humanitarian problem in Somalia. And there are a variety of ways about going to that. We're trying to look into putting up a commission of inquiry into Somalia in order to start getting at the underlying questions to really plan out who the players are. But it's really trying to push the UN to act on that so that there is a different type of response, not one that's purely humanitarian. If
I could just follow up on that, I agree that I just want to clarify that what she means by this hesitancy to get involved, it's not that the international community is non-involved. They are involved to the tune of many, many millions of dollars trying to support the political process, trying to make sure that humanitarian aid comes in. But what they're resistant to doing at this point is to get involved militarily, to go in there and force the delivery of aid in areas where it's contested. And the reason is that this is a long time ago, but 20 years ago, there was another famine, and many, many thousands of people were dying as well. And the United Nations and the Americans did get involved and send 25,000 American troops. Now, as a result of that, there were skirmishes with the warlords who were vying for control of the country at that time. And as you may recall, 18 American soldiers were killed in this notorious incident that was made into a movie, Black Hawk Down. So at a time, it was very difficult for the United States after that politically to tell its people that it's worth risking American lives in this way to save many hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, that doesn't mean that people are thinking that American lives are the only things that are valuable and Somali lives are not valuable, but it's very difficult to convince the American public that it's worth risking American lives to save Somali lives. And you're completely entitled to your own opinion on whether that's right or wrong.
Thank you. And another question from our audience. What has been done to control or eliminate Al-Shabaab? So for this question, I'd like to hear from Jeff Hoover of CARE. Thank you.
I think the obvious answer to that, unfortunately, is not enough. The group is far too powerful and has far too much control over the region to really say that there has been enough done to commit to mitigate this problem, I should say. And really, I mean, the main approach that should be taken is a substantial investment in the foreign operations budget of our federal government and of other Western and governments around the world. And the reason I say that is because it's an absolutely proven down payment on security, both for ourselves and the region. And committing a relatively small amount of money up front to finance foreign aid programs is a proven way to help combat these issues without having to commit many more trillions of dollars of Western and American money, and as we've just been talking about, American lives as well. So from looking back, I think, as I said, clearly the answer is not enough, but we have a real opportunity now to make that commitment going forward. And time and again, it's been proven that humanitarian situations and humanitarian crises breed these sorts of groups. I mean, you look at Al-Qaeda, you look at the West Bank, everywhere around the world where you've seen humanitarian crisis is a lot of times turned into a hotbed for militant terrorist groups such as this.
Thank you so much. And these are wonderful questions. Please keep them coming. From the UK, what can be done to ensure our funds and support reach those in need? And what charity organization should we use? So people trying to figure out what they can do to help. This question will go to Greg for. Go right ahead.
Actually, I think it's probably best for Jeff because he works on the humanitarian side.
Thank you. I appreciate your deference here. To answer the second part of the question first, as far as what organizations we use, in an obvious plug here, I'm of course going to talk about my organization, CARE. Just in 2010 alone, we did work. We did program work in over just about 90 countries all across the world. So we really are a worldwide organization. So for our listeners in the UK, there is a CARE UK division. We have country offices in Africa that are putting a great deal of time, energy, and resources into this mission here. As far as getting involved, obviously, as we talked about earlier, contributions are needed. The money is spent with the utmost integrity and transparency, so you do know what your money's going to, but it can't stop there. For all of our listeners and participants in the U.S., and again, this goes for really everywhere, you need to get involved on the political front. You need to make sure that we hold our government and our people responsible in this country to make sure that they don't shy away from what really needs to be done. And we need to let them know really that they do have our consent to get involved and to spend some of our money and to spend some of their time and energy and resources trying to get this done. So again, it really is going to take, as I spoke of earlier, even on our end, a comprehensive approach, because what we have to do and what we have to put into this is really, of course, absolutely nothing compared to what is being put into this on the front lines of this battle.
Thank you for that. And Jeff, just to follow up, specifically for youth, what can they be doing? A lot of our audience is full of youth. Can you just please explain a little more what they can do? Thanks.
Absolutely. I appreciate you coming back to me as soon as I handed the microphone back. I remembered something I wanted to say. Coming up on October 17th, CARE, and along with a number of our sister organizations, are sponsoring what we call our National Day of Action to eradicate poverty. Again, this is October 17th. You can really mark this day however you want. If you go to our website, www.care.org/NDA, that's ND as in dog A, for National Day of Action. There are a lot of details about what we're going to be planning, and the great thing about this is that it lets you really mark this and get involved however you want. One of our big suggestions, we work in conjunction with the Global Poverty Project, is called Live Below the Line campaign. And that's where you mark this one day by allotting $1.50 to feed yourself for the entire day. Now, this is, again, nothing compared to, over 1 billion people around the world who live on $1.50 a day, all expenses told. We're talking about just food. So whether you do it by yourself, whether you do it with friends, create a dinner out of it, a party, however you want to mark it, just knowing what these people on a very, very small scale are going through is incredibly valuable. It spreads awareness to what we're doing and really engages people who have, for various reasons, otherwise not been engaged in this process. So marking our National Day of Action by this Live Below the Line campaign, CARE itself, we're going to be sponsoring a lot of informational events. And again, mark that day, call your congressman, call your senators, tell them to do something about this, tell them to support a very strong foreign operations budget so we can continue to work in these areas and address them, as they are created newly elsewhere.
Thank you for that. And a very important question that we'll continue to answer. What can we do to help? A recent UN report stated the famine recently spread to a sixth part of southern Somalia, putting 750,000 more people at risk in the next few months unless aid efforts are scaled up. So there is an urgency to take action to give aid to one of the most vulnerable people, the Somali population. At Global Nomads Group, we mainly work with youth. So my question, since Jeff already answered it very well, to Jamie this time, what can youth do to help?
I think what would be really valuable is that youths who are involved in school projects or extracurricular writing classes or writing projects, it would be great to continue creating momentum on keeping this topic alive by writing articles and getting online. And I've met students who blog about Somalia to try to raise awareness among other students, among their friends. So to keep the conversation alive, because I feel like in July and August there was this peak of information about Somalia. Coming from Washington, D.C., there was a lot of talk, and then all of a sudden it tapered off. So to keep involvement alive, because awareness needs to be maintained so that global goals can be reached to provide humanitarian assistance and keep solutions coming forward to the conflict.
Thank you. And we also have an answer from a gentleman from the African Future Organization joining us from Kenya. We asked, what can we do to help? And his answer was donations. With just $5, a Somali will have food for at least 2 weeks. Every dollar counts. We have the manpower and access to food and to the victims of this tragic famine. We need the funding to save lives and long-term solutions to prevent tragedy like this to happen again. We can stop if we all work together. Now again, what can we do to help? Focusing on youth. Abdi, this question's for you. What can youth do? Someone like you, a college student, to help?
First and foremost, I want to say we've been doing a lot of things out here in Minneapolis that I wanted to really give advice to the youth that are all over, is to specifically do, fundraising if they can, do car washes, do like cultural beneficial events, and things of that sort. And one thing that we also, one thing that I really also encourage the youth to do is the number one thing is to care. Number one thing is to care about these people, because once you care, you can make awareness. And also stay updated. And through this, hopefully, we want to show the documentary of the DOP on thepoetnation.com, and hopefully stay connected.
Yes, and fundraising is a really great way, and a lot of schools can get together and do that as a class, so thank you for that response. We have a question from our audience. Why are they committed to using children as soldiers? So I'll direct this question to Greg, and then maybe Abdi can answer as well.
I don't know if either side in the conflict, really it's a conflict with many sides. There's not just one Islamic militant group, there's also been a group called Hizbul Islam, although they kind of merged with Al-Shabaab, and also the government. I don't know if anybody's committed specifically to using child soldiers. I think it's just more that it's an environment in which nobody's really immune to the conflict. You have a place where there's really no institutions like we know here. There aren't schools where people go to school. It's not like every child is going to be in school. It's not like every child is going to have economic opportunities once they leave school. So you don't have a situation where people are immune to suffering and conflict just because they're children. It's really an environment where survival is of a paramount importance. So nobody's really exempted. Nobody can escape this. And this is for much of the country. Not all of it, of course, but this is for many parts of the country.
Thank you. And Abdi, could you answer? Do you think they're committed to using children as soldiers, and why?
I think, there's a lot of child soldiers in Somalia, and this situation really makes me sick to my stomach, because I feel like, a lot of these kids are taken advantage of, from people who have resources and that say, you know what, you want some money, you want some food, you want your family to survive, this is a good option. And this is why a lot of, little kids really they have nothing to do. The environment just allows them to, do nothing and just sit around all day. And, this is a chance for them to do something, get affiliated with something, and that is not really good at all.
Thank you for that. And now we have another question from our audience, and this one is for Jeffrey. How is CARE coordinating with other aid organizations such as the Red Cross?
That's a great question. I think it is really important to know that the development community is really made up of a number of organizations and NGOs or non-governmental organizations, and they're all doing really, really fantastic work and should all be recognized for that. And that really leads right to my point, is obviously no one organization can do everything or be everywhere all the time, and that absolutely does hold true for CARE as well. And we're partnering in a number of ways, from on the large scale, where if CARE has been, or CARE US has been asked to not be in a country, which I believe has been made clear by Al-Shabaab, we'll obviously work with other organizations that do have the access to to be there. We'll drive our resources to them, because we are an organization that really can bring substantial resources to bear. So we'll partner on the large scale like that, but most importantly, we'll partner with other organizations on the ground and in the individual communities and with the communities themselves. Because what we've found through our 65 years of action around the world is that empowering the people and empowering women and children who are disproportionately affected by these tragedies is really the way to make lasting change. Again, as opposed to just giving money, what we want to do is we want to help provide work for people. So we'll partner with other organizations and local organizations to actually provide work for the local people, as opposed to just handing them food or as opposed to just handing them cash. We'll actually turn down government funding so we can provide local people with local food, and then that obviously drives business to local markets. We'll pay people the cash value of their livestock if it's not fit, even if it's not fit for market. So we can actually help people generate. So, we'll work with other organizations on the large scale, and we'll work with whatever organization can deliver the most immediate aid to deliver the immediately necessary life-saving services. But what we'll also do, we'll partner with the locals, the local communities, the local governments, local NGOs to really empower the citizenry in the communities, because again, that is the way that we've found through decades of experience to create lasting change. I hate to sound like a cliche here, but it really is the old adage: if you give someone a fish, they'll eat for a day. You teach them to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime, and that is absolutely CARE's adage when it comes to this situation.
Thank you. And a question for Jamie from our audience. Do you feel Western governments are seeing what is happening, and what messages are they sending to the world?
I think that Western governments are recognizing what's happening. It's a difference between recognizing what's happening and acting on what's happening. Aside from providing funding, and of course not enough funding for the current crisis, there's the issue of taking action for the deeper rooted conflict. And I think that's where different agendas emerge. The US has interest because of al-Shabaab and the ties to al-Qaeda and the regional implications for that. But then you also have donor governments who are interested for other reasons. You have the Kenyan government, which is hosting an enormous amount of refugees, and they are dealing with this enormous burden. So there's different responses in all those ways by involvement that's regional, that's international. But I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing is that there's not enough action on how to get to the underlying issues that are fueling the crisis. And that's what I think needs to be done, is to see how we can get the international community involved and those Western actors to do more than just put money out there. And that's where you have this divide between what's being done and what needs to be done.
Thank you. And speaking about the refugee camps, the Dadaab refugee camp is currently the world's largest. So my next question is for Abdi. Just how many people are in the refugee camp? And also, to follow up, we have a question from our audience. What is it like to live in a refugee camp?
To answer your first question, I believe the camp was made for about 70,000 people, and now it is over 450,000. It is soon to reach 500,000 people. And as far as the second question, what is life like in the refugee camp? Honestly, there is no life over there. There is no life when really all you can think about every single day of your life in the camp is just a sip of water. That's all you're thinking of every day. There's no life there. That's far different from what life is over here, or what life was back when the famine happened back when I was there in '91.
Thank you so much for sharing. I know that must be a difficult question, so I really appreciate your story. Thank you. And one other question from our audience. What can we do to improve the non-functional government in Somalia? So this I'll direct at Greg, if you could please answer this question.
Well, the truth is that the international community doesn't know how to improve the functioning of the Somali government. They've invested a lot in it over the years, and the government is so divided in so many factions that it squabbles internally a lot, it falls apart a lot, and it can't really gain any traction. Part of this, to be fair, is a legacy of the Cold War and the history of Somalia and its conflicts with Ethiopia. Somalia and Ethiopia, they were tied up and they were caught up in our struggles with the Soviet Union. So we would back one side and the Soviet Union would back another side. And this went on for decades. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union and throughout the course of the 80s, there was a lot of arms in the country. There was a lot of weapons in the country, and there was a lot of corruption in the country, and there were a lot of accusations about the president at the time who favoring his own clan. So you had a lot of rebellions break out, and in 1991 the central government essentially collapsed. At the same time, Ethiopia's government was overthrown by rebels as well. And so after that, you had a scramble, and you've had a fight for control over the country with a number of armed groups for many years. You've had about 15 attempts to establish a central functioning government in that time, in those 20 years. We still haven't gotten it right. So I think one thing that the Americans are starting to support is this notion of, okay, we'll try to support the central functioning government, a central government, but we'll also try to establish and support to local regional governments. This is their newest thinking. Whether it will work, it's unclear. But nobody really knows the answer to that question. That's the problem.
Thank you. And our next question is for Jeff. We have from the school in the UK. As a school, what can we do to pressure the UK government into recognizing the necessity for international aid?
Thank you for the question. That is really, I'd answer the same way as if an American student had asked that, or really any other student from any other country had asked that. And it's the same things you can do here. And I think the good news for the folks in the UK is, I'd have to guess that your members of parliament and your government are in all reality going to be more accessible than ours. So you want to get together with your classmates and make phone calls, and send emails, send faxes, write letters, get your parents and your friends to do the same. A lot of people, I've found are still going to be relatively disengaged from this. Inform them, spread the word, and just like we've been talking about all day, the more light we shed on this situation, the more media attention it gets, the more the government is really going to be shamed into doing it. So again, it's really a no holds barred scenario, in a sense that there's really nothing that you don't want to ask of people. Again, you want to be almost shameless in your plugs to get them to call and email, talk to their MPs, talk to any local officials they have to do the same, talk to your parents and friends, and just create almost an all-encompassing situation where, whatever the government does, they can't get away from this issue, because they will probably try.
Thank you for that. And now a question for Jamie from our audience. Since the American government has hesitated to get involved with military, what else can we do?
Well, the question of using the U.S. military at this point, I don't know what goal we would want to achieve with that. The first issue is really securing humanitarian assistance for the immediate. And the problem is that regardless of what we do, Al-Shabaab is not going to go away. And it's not just one militant. I think Greg already mentioned that it's not one faction, it's many factions under one name. And you have a militant side, and there are more centrist sides. And for any type of resolution of the conflict, Al-Shabaab is going to have to be a part of something. So using the U.S. military probably wouldn't be the best solution to a stable Somalia, unless we're talking about peacekeeping, and that's something else. But basically, I think what Human Rights Watch is mainly calling for is for us to examine the situation, go back, and to provide a roadmap by which Somalia can move forward. And that's a future that is going to see a transitional federal government that's probably going to have to work with Al-Shabaab to come to a long-term solution. So U.S. military involvement is not necessarily necessary, but U.S. involvement with funding, with assistance in that way, definitely still is.
And one other point to add here is that, again, I completely agree that, I think clearly overt military action is I think obviously not the answer at this point. In talking about engaging with Al-Shabaab, currently there are restrictions in place that govern whether, how donors allocate their money and really decide who it goes to, in the sense that, even incidentally, any aid, can't go to benefiting, groups like Al-Shabaab in any fashion. And obviously, we don't want to subsidize any group that would wish to do its own people or the United States or any of our allies harm. But that being the case and those rules currently being in place, we're currently making it much more difficult and in a number of cases restricting actually tens of thousands, if not hundreds or millions of thousands of people, who otherwise could be receiving the aid.
And one other question from our audience. What can we do to improve the non-functional government in Somalia? So this I'll direct at Greg, if you could please answer this question.
Well, the truth is that the international community doesn't know how to improve the functioning of the Somali government. They've invested a lot in it over the years, and the government is so divided in so many factions that it squabbles internally a lot, it falls apart a lot, and it can't really gain any traction. Part of this, to be fair, is a legacy of the Cold War and the history of Somalia and its conflicts with Ethiopia. Somalia and Ethiopia, they were tied up and they were caught up in our struggles with the Soviet Union. So we would back one side and the Soviet Union would back another side. And this went on for decades. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union and throughout the course of the 80s, there was a lot of arms in the country, there was a lot of weapons in the country, and there was a lot of corruption in the country, and there were a lot of accusations about the president at the time who favoring his own clan. So you had a lot of rebellions break out, and in 1991 the central government essentially collapsed. At the same time, Ethiopia's government was overthrown by rebels as well. And so after that, you had a scramble, and you've had a fight for control over the country with a number of armed groups for many years. You've had about 15 attempts to establish a central functioning government in that time, in those 20 years. We still haven't gotten it right. So I think one thing that the Americans are starting to support is this notion of, okay, we'll try to support the central functioning government, a central government, but we'll also try to establish and support to local regional governments. This is their newest thinking. Whether it will work, it's unclear. But nobody really knows the answer to that question. That's the problem.
Thank you. And our next question is for Jeff. We have from the school in the UK. As a school, what can we do to pressure the UK government into recognizing the necessity for international aid?
Thank you for the question. That is really, I'd answer the same way as if an American student had asked that, or really any other student from any other country had asked that. And it's the same things you can do here. And I think the good news for the folks in the UK is, I'd have to guess that your members of parliament and your government are in all reality going to be more accessible than ours. So you want to get together with your classmates and make phone calls, and send emails, send faxes, write letters, get your parents and your friends to do the same. A lot of people, I've found are still going to be relatively disengaged from this. Inform them, spread the word, and just like we've been talking about all day, the more light we shed on this situation, the more media attention it gets, the more the government is really going to be shamed into doing it. So again, it's really a no holds barred scenario in a sense that there's really nothing that you don't want to ask of people. Again, you want to be almost shameless in your plugs to get them to call and email, talk to their MPs, talk to any local officials they have to do the same, talk to your parents and friends, and just create almost an all-encompassing situation where, whatever the government does, they can't get away from this issue, because they will probably try.
Thank you for that. And now a question for Jamie from our audience. Since the American government has hesitated to get involved with military, what else can we do?
Well, the question of using the U.S. military at this point, I don't know what goal we would want to achieve with that. The first issue is really securing humanitarian assistance for the immediate. And the problem is that regardless of what we do, Al-Shabaab is not going to go away. And it's not just one militant. I think Greg already mentioned that it's not one faction, it's many factions under one name. And you have a militant side, and there are more centrist sides. And for any type of resolution of the conflict, al-Shabaab is going to have to be a part of something. So using the U.S. military probably wouldn't be the best solution to a stable Somalia, unless we're talking about peacekeeping, and that's something else. But basically, I think what Human Rights Watch is mainly calling for is for us to examine the situation, go back, and to provide a roadmap by which Somalia can move forward. And that's a future that is going to see a transitional federal government that's probably going to have to work with al-Shabaab to come to a long-term solution. So U.S. military involvement is not necessarily necessary, but U.S. involvement with funding, with assistance in that way, definitely still is.
And one other point to add here is that, again, I completely agree that, I think clearly overt military action is I think obviously not the answer at this point. In talking about engaging with al-Shabaab, currently there are restrictions in place that govern whether, how donors allocate their money and really decide who it goes to, in the sense that, even incidentally, any aid, can't go to benefiting, groups like al-Shabaab in any fashion, and obviously, we don't want to subsidize any group that would wish to do its own people or the United States or any of our allies harm. But that being the case, and those rules currently being in place, we're currently making it much more difficult, and in a number of cases restricting actually tens of thousands, if not hundreds or millions of thousands of people, who otherwise could be receiving the aid.
Thank you. So we hope to inspire our audience to help. I'm going to ask all of you if you can share your personal motivation behind this. We'll start with Greg.
Well, for us, it's simple and complicated. I mean, first of all, as people who cover the news, this is by far the biggest news in that region, in the Horn of Africa. I mean, there's nothing really more important than the potential survival or death of 750,000 people. On a personal level, we all have great empathy for the suffering of people of Somalia because we've covered them for many years, and we've chronicled and basically written into history the kinds of things that they've gone through. So we understand that it's been a really, really difficult road for them. And it's not likely to get much better anytime soon without enormous, enormous help.
Thank you, Greg. And now, Jamie, your personal inspiration.
I work specifically on the Horn of Africa, so this situation is actually not just impacting Somalis. It's Kenyans who are working in the Dadaab camps at the border, and the involvement of the Kenyan government and the Kenyan police, and then the famine itself is impacting its neighbors, Ethiopia and Eritrea. So this famine is much larger than just Somalia, and the conflict is frankly larger than just Somalia. Personally, I'm invested because of, like Greg said, empathy, and also just an interest in the world and what's going on elsewhere. And for people who don't have access to the same opportunities, and the knowledge that you have children in the Dadaab camps who don't have basic access to education, and that reality, and being able to somehow contribute to having those voices heard through my work is really what drives me, and to hopefully help remedy their situation by advocacy is really what drives me personally.
Now, CARE has, for years, of course, been a leader in the humanitarian world, and specifically with this crisis, nearly 70% of the families arriving at the Dadaab camp are women-led families. This, like so many other natural disasters and famines and droughts, affect women and children disproportionately more than they do men and boys. Of course, men and boys that are suffering greatly, but to a far extent, women and children are suffering to a further degree. They're the ones tasked with collecting water, and they'll oftentimes be the last ones to eat, the last ones to go to school, to give them a pathway out of situations like this. So, from a organizational sense, CARE, this is really a natural situation. Aside from just being a humanitarian crisis, this is a natural situation for CARE to be involved in. And I have to echo the point of my panelists here of, on a personal level, this is clearly just a heartbreaking situation where you see really the depths of human suffering here, and the real tragedy is that there are so many factors of this that, if handled differently 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, or today, could be made significantly better. And we could have avoided situations like this. And that's really my end goal, is to be part of the solution, I think, moving forward, and creating a scenario where we're much better able to handle situations like this, if not avoid them completely.
And lastly, Abdi, if you could please share your personal inspiration.
I think right now, my inspiration really comes from these people, and just looking at them in the eyes and seeing what they're going through is really, really horrific. And just being told, I just wanted to tell you one little short story. I know we're about to finish up. I met this old lady at the camp, in Dadaab refugee camp in Hagardere. And I've asked her, as me representing the youth that are all over, what do you want us to do for you when I go back? What do you want me to tell them? And she said, by the time the story gets out to them, I'll probably be dead. But all I want you to know at the end of the day, I don't want no food from you guys. I don't want, shoes. I don't want anything else. I don't want shelter. The only thing I want you guys to do is just care. And that's exactly what I'm doing, is just creating awareness. And my strength really comes from those people.
Thank you, Abdi. And now, everyone, we'll go back to the poll question. So it was, what do you think is causing the crisis in Somalia and the Horn of Africa? The possibilities was lack of rain, poverty, political corruption, or all of the above. Some of you chose poverty, some political corruption, but the majority of you actually put all of the above, which is the correct answer. So all of those play a role in what is causing the crisis in Somalia and in the Horn of Africa. So that unfortunately concludes our webcast for today. Many thanks for everyone for participating, our panelists, and especially the New York Times Learning Network. We all have learned that there are no easy answers to combat this crisis, but we must try. Please refer to Global Nomads Group and New York Times Learning Network's Facebook and Twitter pages for additional resources and ways that you can help, including a lesson plan on the New York Times Learning Network's blog. Raising awareness is a start. So thank you again for all of you participating, and tell us what you thought of the webcast and email us at info@gng.org. Thank you again.
Thank you.